The moment my sister and I stepped into the old house, it felt like the air itself had a weight, thick with the silence of years gone by. Our parents had insisted we stay the night in the house we had inherited from a distant aunt. We were told it was just an old building, nothing more. But as we moved through the dusty corridors, the eerie calm settled over us like a second skin. That first night, we were too exhausted to be scared. After hours of cleaning the forgotten rooms, we finally collapsed in the same bedroom, the one with the least amount of cobwebs and the sturdiest-looking bed. It was just after midnight when we drifted off, the house creaking around us like it was settling in for the night. A little after 1 a.m., I woke up to a noise soft at first, but growing louder with each moment. The door, once firmly shut, creaked open slowly, as if an invisible hand was pushing it. My heart raced as I tiptoed over and closed it. It felt normal. Maybe it was just the draft from the old windows. But as soon as I returned to bed, the door creaked again. The slow, deliberate sound sent chills down my spine. I jumped up and shut it, harder this time, hoping to silence the unease creeping into my bones. It didn't help. Before I could close my eyes, I heard it again. And this time, as I lay under my blanket, frozen in fear, I heard something else, something worse. A woman's voice, barely a whisper, close and distant at once. Run, run, run. Shaken, I jolted out of bed, my heart hammering in my chest. I could feel the cold sweat running down my back. Without wasting another second, I shook my sister awake, whispering fiercely about what I had heard. She stared at me, half asleep and unimpressed. "It's probably your imagination. You've always been a bit jumpy," she said, brushing me off. But the tension in the room was palpable, thick like fog in the early hours. We went to the kitchen to grab some water, trying to calm my nerves. As we sat at the table, I kept glancing at the doorway, half expecting something to emerge from the shadows. And then, without warning, the drawers in the kitchen flew open violently, utensils and cutlery crashing to the floor as if an unseen force had ripped them out in a fit of rage. With them, my sister's voice trailed off, her eyes wide with terror. The house had awoken. That night became a haze of terror. We fled to our parents' room, shaking them awake, explaining what had happened. Our father, ever the skeptic, shrugged it off. "Old houses make noises," he muttered. "There's nothing here." But even he couldn't deny the gravity in the air. We stayed up for the rest of the night, every creak and groan of the house fueling our fear. We kept the lights on, watching the walls as though they might come alive. It wasn't until we finally fled the house the next morning, leaving behind the eerie rooms and unsettling darkness, that I noticed something strange. As we hurried down the hallway, I caught a glimpse of something in the cracked old mirror by the staircase, a fleeting reflection of a woman, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, standing in the shadows. I stopped in my tracks, my heart leaping to my throat. But when I turned, she was gone. In the weeks that followed, we couldn't shake the feeling of unease. My sister and I couldn't stop talking about that night. We combed through old records of the house's history, hoping to make sense of what we had experienced. And that's when we found it, a chilling article in an old newspaper. The house, it seemed, carried a dark legacy. It had once belonged to a family that had perished under mysterious circumstances. The woman of the house had vanished, and the husband and children had been found dead months later, their bodies in advanced stages of decay. No one knew what had happened to them, but the house had been abandoned ever since. There were whispers in the town that anyone who stayed too long in that house met a tragic end. A curse, some said, placed upon the very foundations of the building. And that's when we realized, the voice I heard, the one that whispered, "Run, run, run." It had been a warning. Despite the house's sinister reputation, there was still something that drew me back. An urge to confront the darkness, to understand what had happened all those years ago. Against my better judgment, I returned one last time, this time alone. As I walked through the door, the silence greeted me like an old friend. The air was still thick with that same tension, the same heavy energy. I moved cautiously through the rooms, every step echoing like a threat. And then I heard it again, the same whisper, the same desperate plea, "Run, run." This time I listened. I ran. And I didn't look back. To this day, I still feel like something from that house is following me. Shadows flicker in my peripheral vision, whispers come when I'm alone, and doors sometimes creak open when no one is there. Whatever was in that house, it's still out there. And it's watching. It had been a week since we'd opened the wardrobe, and the nightmares had only intensified. Our parents had noticed how drained and paranoid my sister and I had become, but they chalked it up to stress or growing pains. They didn't believe us, not even when the strange occurrences in the house became undeniable, items moving on their own, icy drafts in rooms with closed windows, and the feeling of being watched constantly. One evening, I was alone in my room, staring into the mirror, trying to convince myself that it was all just in my head. But then I saw her. The woman from the wardrobe appeared in the reflection behind me, her hollow eyes boring into mine. I spun around, but no one was there. I looked back at the mirror, and she was closer, right behind me, her cold breath on my neck. "You let me out." I screamed and shattered the mirror with the nearest object I could find, sending shards of glass flying across the room. My sister came rushing in, and I tried to explain what had happened. But she didn't need convincing. She had seen the woman too, just hours before, in the reflection of the kitchen window. The woman wasn't just haunting our dreams anymore. She was real, and she was growing stronger. Desperate for answers, we returned to the journal, searching for anything that might help us understand the curse. That's when we found the final entry, hidden in the back of the journal, scribbled hastily and almost illegible. The woman is a spirit bound to this place, but she is no ordinary ghost. She was a witch, executed centuries ago for practicing dark magic. The wardrobe was her prison, sealed with spells to keep her from escaping into the world of the living. But if the wardrobe is opened, her spirit will be unleashed, free to take vengeance on anyone who disturbs her. I could barely believe what I was reading. A witch? It sounded impossible, like something out of a horror movie. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. The voice, the figure in the mirror, the nightmares, it was all connected. But there was more. To stop her, the wardrobe must be sealed again. But the one who opened it must offer something precious, something irreplaceable, to close the door between worlds. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I had opened the wardrobe. It was my fault. And now I would have to pay the price to stop her. With no other options, we returned to the cursed house. Our parents thought we were going to spend the weekend with friends, but in reality, we were preparing for the most terrifying confrontation of our lives. I brought the journal, hoping it would guide us, though my hands shook as I held it. My sister was with me, just as terrified but determined to see this through. We didn't speak much as we made our way through the empty streets to the house, but the air was thick with dread. When we arrived, the house looked darker than ever, almost as if it were waiting for us. The moment we stepped inside, the air grew cold, and the familiar whisper filled the room. "You've returned." We made our way to the wardrobe room. The door was already ajar, as if the house knew we were coming. With trembling hands, I opened the wardrobe again, this time prepared for what I would see. The woman stood inside, her hollow eyes gleaming with malice. "You cannot stop me," she hissed. "The seal is broken, and now I am free." I recited the words from the journal, words of power that I hoped would bind her again. But she laughed, a deep, bone-chilling laugh that echoed through the house. An offer must be made. I knew what I had to do. My sister tried to stop me, but I had already made up my mind. "Take me," I whispered, stepping forward. "I'm the one who opened the wardrobe. I'll give myself to seal it." The woman smiled, her ghostly figure growing closer. "Very well," she whispered. "But know this, sacrifices are not always what they seem." With no other options, we returned to the cursed house. Our parents thought we were going to spend the weekend with friends, but in reality, we were preparing for the most terrifying confrontation of our lives. I brought the journal, hoping it would guide us, though my hands shook as I held it. My sister was with me, just as terrified but determined to see this through. We didn't speak much as we made our way through the empty streets to the house, but the air was thick with dread. When we arrived, the house looked darker than ever, almost as if it were waiting for us. The moment we stepped inside, the air grew cold, and the familiar whisper filled the room. "You've returned." We made our way to the wardrobe room. The door was already ajar, as if the house knew we were coming. With trembling hands, I opened the wardrobe again, this time prepared for what I would see. The woman stood inside, her hollow eyes gleaming with malice. "You cannot stop me," she hissed. "The seal is broken, and now I am free." I recited the words from the journal, words of power that I hoped would bind her again. But she laughed, a deep, bone-chilling laugh that echoed through the house. An offer must be made. I knew what I had to do. My sister tried to stop me, but I had already made up my mind. "Take me," I whispered, stepping forward. "I'm the one who opened the wardrobe. I'll give myself to seal it." The woman smiled, her ghostly figure growing closer. "Very well," she whispered. "But know this, sacrifices are not always what they seem." As soon as the words left my lips, the ground beneath us shook, and the air in the room seemed to compress. The woman's eyes locked onto mine, and I felt an overwhelming sensation of cold wrapping around my body, like invisible hands pulling me toward her. I screamed as her ghostly fingers reached out, and just as they were about to touch me, something changed. The woman paused, her expression shifting. She looked not at me, but at my sister, who had been clutching my arm, trying to pull me back. "No," the woman hissed. "Not you." Suddenly, I felt my sister jerk away, pulled by an unseen force toward the wardrobe. The woman's gaze fixed on her, and I realized, with a horrifying clarity, that my sister was the one she wanted all along. The room filled with a deafening roar as my sister was lifted off her feet, her body suspended in midair. I shouted her name, but it was no use. The witch's curse had decided, and no words or pleas could change it. "Her sacrifice will be enough," the woman whispered. In that moment, everything went dark. When I awoke, I was lying on the cold floor of the old house, my sister nowhere to be seen. The wardrobe was closed, the room silent and still, as if nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. I searched the house, calling my sister's name, but there was no trace of her. She was gone, taken by the curse. The woman's words echoed in my mind. Sacrifices are not always what they seem. I realized then that the price for sealing the wardrobe had been my sister, not me. She had unknowingly offered herself the moment she tried to save me, and now she was lost to whatever dark dimension the witch's spirit inhabited. I left the house that day, but it never truly left me. Every night I dream of my sister, trapped in the wardrobe's darkness, calling out for me, but always just out of reach. The curse may have been sealed, but the cost was far greater than I ever could have imagined. I returned home to our parents, but I could never bring myself to tell them the full truth. How could I explain that I had lost my sister to a curse we unleashed? The house remains abandoned and silent. But I know better. The curse still lives within it, waiting for the next fool to open the wardrobe. And every night I hear her voice. Run, run, run. After the unsettling experiences, life slowly returned to a somewhat peaceful routine. But peace in this old house was deceptive. Strange things happened often enough for us to dismiss them as tricks of the mind or the result of our overactive imaginations. We stayed away from certain rooms, ignored odd noises, and continued living as though nothing was truly wrong. But one evening, everything changed again. While cleaning the attic, I stumbled upon an old journal tucked away in a dusty corner behind a loose floorboard. The leather cover was cracked with age, and the pages were yellowed, but the handwriting was still legible. It seemed to be a record kept by one of the house's previous owners, a woman named Evelyn Whitmore. The entries started off innocently enough, details of daily life, her husband, and their 2 children, but soon they took a darker turn. Evelyn began to write about hearing voices, about shadows moving in the house when no one else was around. She described sleepless nights where the air in the house felt thick and heavy, almost suffocating. But what made my blood run cold was the entry from her last days, which described the exact same voice I had heard, the one that whispered, "Run, run, run." As I read on, Evelyn detailed how her husband began acting strangely, obsessed with something in the basement. He claimed to have uncovered a secret, something hidden for generations, but the details were vague. Her last entry ended abruptly, and the rest of the pages were torn out, as though someone had intentionally removed the most crucial parts. I took the journal to my sister, showing her what I'd found. Her face drained of color as she read the entries aloud. There was no doubt, Evelyn had experienced the same terrifying occurrences we were now living through. But what was in the basement? With the journal weighing heavily on our minds, we knew we had to investigate the basement. We had avoided it for weeks, ever since the strange happenings had begun. The few times we went down there, we felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as though something was watching us. But now we had no choice. If Evelyn's last entry was any clue, the basement held the answers we sought. Armed with flashlights and nerves of steel, we descended the narrow stairs, the wood creaking under our weight. The basement smelled musty, and the air was damp. At first glance, it was just like any other, old furniture covered with sheets, forgotten boxes of trinkets, and a layer of dust thick enough to suggest no one had been down here in years. But then, my sister noticed something. The back wall of the basement wasn't solid stone as the others were. Instead, it appeared to be a thin wooden partition, recently added, as though it was hiding something. We exchanged a nervous glance before I cautiously pushed against it. The wood gave way easily, revealing a hidden alcove behind the wall. Inside the alcove was a small, stone altar covered in dust, with strange symbols carved into the surface. But what truly unnerved us was the object resting on the altar, a tarnished, old key. "What's this for?" my sister whispered, picking up the key with trembling hands. "I don't know," I replied, equally shaken. "But I think we're about to find out." As we stared at the key, we felt a gust of cold wind blow through the basement, despite the fact that there were no windows or doors open. A voice echoed faintly in the distance, "Run, run, run." Back upstairs, we tried to make sense of what we had found. The key looked ancient, but we had no idea what it opened. We searched the house from top to bottom, testing every lock we could find, but none of them fit. Frustrated and scared, we began to feel like we were running out of options. That night, the house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. I couldn't sleep, so I found myself wandering the halls, the key still clutched in my hand. My sister was sound asleep, oblivious to the growing tension in the air. As I walked past the old grandfather clock in the hallway, something caught my eye, a small, barely noticeable keyhole hidden beneath the clock's pendulum. With trembling hands, I inserted the key. It clicked. The clock made a grinding noise, and the wall behind it slowly slid open, revealing a hidden staircase descending into complete darkness. I hesitated for a moment before waking my sister. We needed to face whatever was down there together. The descent down the hidden staircase felt endless. The air grew colder with every step, and the oppressive sense of dread returned, thicker than ever. At the bottom of the stairs, we found ourselves in a room that seemed far older than the rest of the house, its walls made of rough stone, and the floor covered in strange, intricate carvings. At the center of the room was a stone chest, sealed shut with iron locks that matched the key we had found in the basement. Whatever was inside had been locked away for centuries. My sister and I exchanged a fearful glance. This was it, the answer to everything. But were we prepared to uncover what had been hidden for so long? With shaking hands, I inserted the key into the chest's lock. The iron gave way with a groan, and the lid creaked open. What we found inside would change everything.